If these rooms feel familiar already, if the hush of gaslight and the promise of what lingers in silver calls to something restless, press the bell and subscribe so the next seance finds this channel at the top of the evening's invitations, and the lamps will be waiting when the darkroom door swings open again. Lean closer and do not disturb the velvet curtains. The fabric shines with a fine bloom where fingertips have worried it smooth, and the coal-stained fog from the street presses its flat nose to the window panes as the last of the daylight leaches into lamplight and a mechanized ticking finds the room's empty corners, the air damp with fixers and ether, the floorboards oiled dark, the parlor chair set precisely where a sitter might have knelt for an apparition and given the plate its ghost. The year is 1874 by the ledger, but the year floats whenever one stands in a room like this, because spirit photography is a habit as much as a date, a superstition grown technical and a ritual given a lens, popular for a decade and more, braided with grief, faith, and the easy deceit of superimposed exposures that can place the dead among the living as simply as laying one image upon another. On the table the evidence waits beneath glass and twine, one albumen print in a tarnished oval frame and a glass plate sealed with black tape. The paper gleams with that slight egg-white sheen that albumen grants, a skin that tightens over the fibers and holds the silver like a breath held too long, while the negative, thick, cold, still carries the fog of a basement where it dried and learned to pretend to be permanent. The scent is its own confession, a mingling of ether and alcohol and nitrate bath, the collodion sweet sting rising from the tray and setting a memory of wet on the tongue, the very process announcing itself as quickly as a heartbeat because with wet plate collodion every act, coat, sensitize, expose, develop, must be accomplished before the plate dries and refuses to remember. Listen, the voice that addresses only one listener now will not raise itself. The night is all eavesdroppers and old paper, and the way of this investigation is to touch each fact once and leave no mark, for here superstition pollinates so easily and we cannot feed it more than necessary. The photograph is a studio scene, a respectable widow in bombazine, hands folded over a locket, seated beside a pedestal draped in dark velvet, behind her the painted column and backdrop, above her right shoulder the spirit, a faint man's head, a suggestion of ear and hair and a slick of light like the smudged crescent of a thumbprint, looking down with that soft compliance all ghosts on paper have learned. The medium who delivered this image took his payment in sovereigns and a promise that the widow would speak of him kindly, and perhaps she did. That does not concern the plate any more than rain concerns stone, because what concerns the plate is that it has been exposed twice, and a double exposure always leaves its seams if one knows the nature of seams. The first seam is the simplest, transparency without shadow or reflection, for the spirit's cheek permits the painted columns fluting to show straight through, undisturbed, and the backdrop's fine cracking runs unbroken across the apparition's brow as if the forehead were a window and the background had a right to pass. Place a ruler to the print in lamplight and see the white line of the column cap continue through the vapor of the face, and notice the absence of any answering shadow from the ghost upon the sitter's shoulder or the drape. There is a refusal to cast or to take shadow, as befits an image that was never present in the moment of light and therefore could not interrupt it. Here the first demonstration begins, not in speech but in a reenactment tender as a forgery. The parlor is rearranged, the velvet undraped, and a chair placed with a taper set just so to mimic the old studio gaslight, while the glass plate, once cleaned and poured with fresh collodion, lies slick as a puddle on the leveled stand, the silver bath giving it its hunger and the wetness dictating urgency because 15 minutes is the outer edge of this technique and anything slower becomes only a dry refusal. The sitter is a shadow borrowed from the hallway. The lens is capped, uncapped, capped again for the brief breath of exposure, and without moving the camera or the chair the room is made empty and the cap lifts once more to take the same arrangement without the weight of a person, so that when the plate meets developer the room pours into a single image with two chances cinched together. This is the elementary definition. Double exposure is the superimposition of two exposures on one light-hungry surface, an artifact of timing and intent, a way to place what was not there into the place where something was. It is ancient already in 1874 and yet it feels new to anyone grieving, because novelty is not a function of time but of need. Return to the print. Begin the second reveal, which is not about transparency but about scale and perspective and that subtle parallax shift that creeps in when the two exposures are cousins rather than twins. Notice the misalignment of the ghost's gaze with the vanishing lines of the studio floor, the way the planes disagree like two stories told side by side that cannot settle into one room. Parallax is a shift in apparent position caused by viewing from two different lines, and even the tiniest variation in camera stance or sitter posture between exposures will set up a disagreement measurable by eye if the eye is patient. So the spirit's ear has a slightly different relationship to the backdrop's seam than the widow's shoulder has to the pedestal's edge, like a whisper translated twice. The second demonstration is a midnight business. The archive yields a crate of dried plates and finished positives, and under a flat flame, overlays are built from tracing paper and cut glass. Align the pedestal across images, then watch the ghost drift like a wayward moon when the overlaid reference finds it cannot sit in 3 places at once. The parlor breathes colder at this hour, but that is the trick of drafts and lungs. Still, as the measurements are read aloud, the numbers prove nothing supernatural, only the ordinary physics of 2 vantage points compressed into one, and the slight keelover of shapes that were never truly coincident, an error that belongs to the geometry and not to the grave. Third, duplicated features mirroring the sitter, that rhyming of detail that betrays the economy of a studio in love with its own inventory. The widow's parting and the spirit's hairline share a wave and a stray set of flyaways, and the ghost's cheek bears an echo of the sitter's softest shadow as if a painter had traced the same hand twice with minor amendments. The history is plain and a little unkind. The adoption of glass plate negatives made it practical to reuse plates and retain prior images as faint echoes that could be coaxed forward again, an economy that spirit photographers exploited by printing the likenesses of past clients into the lives of the new. The collodion plate, prepared in haste and contaminated by a bath gone tired with ether and alcohol and halides, could refuse to clear fully and keep a memory, an ear, a cap, a whisper of lace, that might be turned into proof of persistence with the right patter and the right price. In the darkroom demonstration, a plate known to be just cleaned is held against a plate known to be imperfectly washed. The developer favors old silver as readily as new, and on the second plate, the face that should not be there burgeons up like a bruise beneath the fresh exposure, a repetition of features where no ghost had agreed to pose. Fourth, edge halos, those double outlines along high-contrast borders that whisper of light traveling too far and back again, the airy coronas creeping around the spirit's temple and the bright seam of the backdrop where it meets the shadow halation signature when anti-halation backing is absent and bright points bleed, giving the halo that looks uncannily like a presence but is nothing more than light's poor housekeeping. Halation is a halo-like effect that forms around bright elements because light passes through the emulsion and scatters back, and while still cameras may mitigate reflections with blackened gates, the era's plates and processes were not immune to those red-tinged or bright fringes that bloom at the margins of strongest contrast. Hold a loop to the albumin print and find the faint double aura at the apparition's chin where it crosses the dark velvet. A neat glow that would flatter any spirit's vanity but reveals instead a conversation between emulsion and backing that the camera did not fully chaperone. The demonstration is small and claustrophobic. The darkroom door is shut until breath warms the glass, and a lamp is set to catch the edge of a porcelain stopper. Then its reflection returns through the emulsion and carves a duplicate outline, a luminous bevel on nothing but air, teaching the eye that halos are not heads, only physics in a chemical shirt. Fifth, inconsistent blur and exposure and lighting direction, the soft smears that belong to motion in one exposure but not in the other, the sitter held sharper at the eyelashes while the spirit carries a different softness or falls into a contradictory shadow, as if the room sprouted a second sun while it was looking elsewhere. Wet plate exposures, quick for the time yet long enough that a tremor of breath can paint a ghostliness across a lip, will render that blur, but a double exposure where one component was made seconds or minutes apart can trap 2 separate wind directions in a candle flame or cast shadows that will not stack, a mischief of time rather than of souls. The seance reenactment is ruthless now. A candle is set near a mirror and a sitter told to blink when the cap lifts the second time, producing a thin translucent second set of lids hovering over the first, while the ghost's alibi dissolves an overlapping blur that points to 2 different moments and an artifice of timing rather than visitation. Even the grain of brightness in the widow's locket speaks out of turn. It throws the expected specular glint from the left in the first exposure, then a smaller twin from a shifted angle in the second, a pair of truths that cancel each other and leave only the photographer's slyness on the floor. Sixth, repeating plate defects carrying over into this spirit, those dust motes and emulsion streaks and tiny scratches that appear wherever the older plate asserts itself and imprint across cheek and air alike. A rash of freckles that no person ever wore but that the chemistry insisted upon. Wet plate practice is temperamental and the silver bath becomes fouled with time, allowing impurities and residues to stamp their own hieroglyphs into each image, and these signatures recur when an earlier exposure is reused or when the plate holds on to ghosts of itself, vertical tear-like rivulets, a diagonal scratch, a tiny moon of dust repeating in 2 different skies. Albumin prints, being contact printed from glass negatives, faithfully reproduce such scars upon the paper's glossy skin, a literal transcription of all that the glass carried, whether cherished or regretted, and so the forbidding flex on the apparition's jaw mirror identical flex near the backdrop where no jaw exists, revealing the defect as the author, not any disembodied visitor. In the demonstration, a plate is marked with a pinprick at its edge and then forgotten in the bath, and later, when an apparition is staged, the pin's signature reappears in the margin of the spirit's cheek, a tiny star that neither man nor woman ever had, returned by chemistry as a dog returns with the same stolen glove. If the investigation were only this, only 6 linked set pieces building a case piece by bright piece, the heart would slow back to steadiness and the parlor would empty like any lecture hall. But the hour grows later, and every debunking alters the air without dispersing it, for those who came here did so with want, and want does not leave when facts are provided. Want lingers and borrows another mask. The medium who supplied the original photograph is summoned in a polite note with a frank tone, agreed to a meeting in a tea room beside a chemist's shop, and arrived with gloves and a smile that did not include apology. These men and women are not all frauds in the same ways, and some believe in their own methods with a sincerity that cannot be prosecuted. Words are exchanged without sharpness. The medium speaks of sensitives, and of plates that welcome impressions like pillows welcome the shapes of heads not presently on them, which is metaphysics transposed onto chemistry. In response, the tray is lifted and the collodion poured in his presence, and he nods at the technique as if praising a hymn he cannot sing. The confrontation is not about shouting, it is about allowing the room to do its work, and so the darkroom is chosen for the next passage, tight as a coffin and red-lit, the ticking clock scraping the nerves, the hand steady while the plate drinks silver and the lens counts to 3. Then the cap drops and a chair sits still for its own portrait while the medium presses 2 fingers to his temple and claims he can draw someone here if the heart is willing. 2 exposures made, the developer flowing like ink, and the image rises grain by grain. First the empty chair, then the faintest blooming of a figure that looks like a man without the nuisance of edges, and the medium's breath catches in a practiced way that might have been sincere tonight, for no one enjoys being explained even by physics. The demonstrator's hand knocks the tray in feigned clumsiness so that the wave licks the plate's edge and shows what a streak looks like when born and why it should not be mistaken for ectoplasm. And yet, the ghost remains a little better drawn than the last time such a demonstration was attempted, the outline less cooperative but more insistent. The medium smiles in silence as if the silver had given him a favor. The scientific mind answers by pointing to the earlier marks, to the telltale lack of shadow and the faint mismatch of scale along the chair's rails, the little halos cupping around the highlights, to the double glints riven across a brass nail head. Every clue speaks with a schoolmaster's tone and all of them are correct. Then the archive, always the archive. Midnight grinds its slow teeth on the glass and wood as drawers give up their envelopes. The habit grows of comparing more and more plates, looking for the ancestor of this new face, because most spirits have a family tree in a dealer's cupboard. Here is a man with similar ear. Here a jaw that matches. Here a hairline. Cut them out with light and lay them down as overlays and watch the parallax jitter, that delicate sideways tremor that says these were taken not simply on different days but from slightly different stances, while the studio floor keeps its perfect grid like a stage that has hosted too many rehearsals. There is a grim satisfaction in it, each match a nail sunk into a plank of stagecraft, until only one discrepancy remains, slight but uncooperative. The new plate's spirit carries at the absolute edge of its faint cheek an echo that does not belong to the earlier ancestor plate it appears to quote. It is a tiny loop like a thumb pressed in damp ash, which might be nothing but a processing blemish, and thus the collodion notes are brought out, the ledger where bath changes and developer formulations and the fatigue of the silver nitrate are recorded in a hand as precise as a metronome. There are entries about contamination, about ether and alcohol saturating the bath and causing plates to misbehave, about mysterious failures and stains, all perfectly ordinary, all ready to shoulder the blame. The seance reenactment is mounted a second time because the mind likes recurrences to prove principles. The air is colder not because of ghosts but because the fire died down while attention floated elsewhere, and breath shows for a moment in the lamplight the way any breath will in the right season and mood. The chair is set again, the cap lifted, the cap replaced, the sitter dismissed, the second exposure taken, the developer slick in brown at the lip of the tray. Whisper while it rises because the sound of developer taking is like rain starting, and the ghost that answers is again exactly the ghost requested by the method. Faint, obedient, wrong at the edges in ways that can be diagnosed with reference to the rules that have already been spoken aloud. But this time, a trick of the hour or a trick of the eye, the halo at the spirit's temple briefly shows not merely the familiar backscatter of violent brightness but a darker notch within it, like a bite, a negative halo, as if the halo had been interrupted by a shape so fine it evaded proper exposure. The mind rummages for causes. A hair floating, a speck drifting, a flaw in the emulsion that will repeat itself elsewhere if one knows where to look. Check the plate. Find nothing comparable near the chair's back or along the velvet's border, nothing that would give the defect its twin. Put it down to the bath's moods and file the observation with the rest, which is to say, on a shelf labeled unhelpful. No religion has been invited and none need arrive to explain these 6 tells, yet the air complicates itself with feeling because the widow returned as widows do, to ask not whether her photograph is authentic but whether it helps, and help is not a photographic property or a chemical variable but something that sets its teeth into the mind and drags. The medium declines to gloat over the success of his methods and instead tells a quiet story of a plate kept in a drawer for months that struck his knuckles with cold when he touched it, which is a human way of speaking about a basement's winter and a poor fire in a small grate, not a paranormal phenomenon. The story lands anyway and does its minor work. Meanwhile, the demonstrator spends hours in the darkroom perfecting an explanation anyone could read. Each wet plate is a repetition of a ritual, the collodion poured to the corners, the bath cradled without slosh, the exposure taken within that stern quarter hour, the developer rocked to avoid streaks, the fixer salted through like a cure for meat, and none of it contains the dead, only light and its obedient salts. The albumin prints made from these plates gleam when dry with that faintly glossy sheen egg-white grants, and the paper's own gloss becomes an actor in the misreading of glimmers as presences, a trick of the surface that sentimental eyes gladly enlist. A final demonstration is promised to the medium because stories, like evenings, require closures. The parlor is set for it while the street bells call out an hour that feels later than it is. 2 exposures are made again, but this time the second exposure is not of the empty chair. Instead, a plate from the archive is introduced, its texture cleaned but its heart unchanged, and the lens is made to remember, not emptiness but a previous man in a previous pose, so that the combined image will accuse itself without further testimony. The developer lifts both moments onto the same skin and the accusation appears, stark in its contradictions. A throat that casts no shadow, a lapel with light from a direction the lamp never offered, a halo margin fat with return and too crisp where it should fade, a string of identical dust moons repeating over cheek and backdrop, the parallax wrong enough that the floor's grid becomes a quietly screaming witness. All of this is shown to the medium. The medium nods as if having predicted the outcome, which is, if nothing else, admirable composure, and then the plate, held to the safe light, shows something the demonstration did not plan for. At the border of the ghost's hairline, within the halation, the notch seen earlier appears again, positioned differently relative to the new composite yet shaped with the same negative crescent as if some eclipsing object preferred that precise curve. It is neither dust nor streak because it maps onto no defect elsewhere in the plate, and it is not a proportionate echo of any feature in the borrowed face, and the eye, trained to run explanations like rosary beads, finds that its fingers have reached for a bead that is not there. Show it to the medium. He says nothing and the parlor seems suddenly very interested in its own breath. Then produce a third plate, one from earlier archives unrelated to tonight's actors but from the same studio and the same corner of the same backdrop, and under the loop a faintly similar notch lurks near the edge of another spirit, faint in a place where halation rages, as if some infection had seeded itself long ago in a way that is not contamination and not negligence and not the sort of impurity that rides silver bass to sabotage. Check the ledgers. There is no record of a new lamp, no record of a mirror added, no account of a pressure plate changed, nothing that would explain a particular returning absence of light at an edge where light most exuberantly ought to swim back and overexpose the border. The mind suggests, with reluctance and good sense, that some odd shape in the gate or a black thread kept near the plate for handling might have imprinted itself in play and then been lost, and this is sensible enough to accept that tonight the gate is peerless, the handling careful, and the thread is only in the story, not in the room. Close the demonstration because all demonstrations must close. Wash the plates and set them to dry, and the room takes back its quiet. The widow, thanked into the street, carries her albumin print as if carrying a photograph of a window that opens onto relief, which is a kind of truth, while the medium, in leaving, touches the door frame as though it were the edge of a stage or a tomb, and he smiles, not in victory but as those who treasure ambiguity smile. The voice, this one that has sat beside the shoulder all evening, leans in once, not to whisper comfort which belongs to another profession, but to say that a double exposure remains a double exposure even when it stares back as if it knows the name, and that technique has teeth and can bite the tender parts of desire, that the halation at an edge is a map of physics and not a nimbus, that parallax is honest in its displacement and does not bend to pity, that plate defects, like the flaws in any relic, are a litany of the workshop, not the sanctuary. Yet as the lamp's wick lowers into itself and the last gloss leaves the plates with a sigh, one image among them, newly scoured of its falsehoods, retains the faintest crescent of darkness where brightness should live, a subtraction that is not accounted for, and the wall clock's reflected eye on the plate seems, for one arrested instant, to look at the observer rather than to be looked at. Then all is only glass and silver and the smell of ether again. If the pulse has steadied but the curiosity keeps its grip, if the promise of more rooms like this and more plates held to the safe light is an appealing ache, subscribe now so the next investigation arrives unannounced like a tap at the shutter and stays until the last halo gives up its lie.